Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
All right, let's get back to David and his son Absalom. You know, David is, again, the king by which God measured every other king in the nation of Israel. He would say, "You haven't done fully right as my servant David." And David was just the standard. And he was a great leader, great warrior poet. I mean, he wrote half the Psalms. Just an amazing guy. But you know what? He was not a good dad. Now, he may have loved his kids, but what we see inside of David's life is unfortunately a pattern that is too pervasive inside of success today, and that is many people, men and women, might be incredibly successful at work, but complete failures at home. And that's what we see in the life of David. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, at the end of David's life, Absalom has already passed away. At the end of David's life, we see Absalom's brother kind of repeat what Absalom did. And I want to point this verse out. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. Then Adoniah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. You know what? That's exactly what his brother already tried. And that didn't work out very good for him. So, hey, let's just go ahead and try harder. And his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, "Why have you done so?" And he was also very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom. Now, David had never confronted his son, never said anything that hurt his son's feelings. And unfortunately, as a boss, as parents, as friends, if you never have dialogue that at times hurts somebody's feelings or is a little bit confrontational, you're only breeding a place for rebellion. And that's what we see. So David failed here as a father, at least in Absalom's life and Adoniah's life. And ultimately, Adoniah is going to die because of this act of rebellion at the hands of Solomon. And so David lost two sons because David failed as a father. What's interesting is you look at the life of Moses, there's a brief mention that he had a son named Gershom, and then he had other children. But we don't really know anything about his other children. And often what you'll see is many great leaders, again, who were successful in their career, in their field, unfortunately don't leave a great legacy, per se, inside of their kids. And I was doing some study and reading recently, and I came across this. A gentleman named Rabbi Harold Kushner in a book entitled Overcoming Life's Disappointments. He writes about this very subject, and he says this: "Sometimes the father casts so large a shadow that he makes it hard for his children to find the sunshine they need to grow and flourish. Sometimes the father's achievements are so intimidating that the child just gives up any hope of equaling him at all. But mostly, I suspect, it takes so much of a man's or a father's time and energy to be a great man, great in some ways, but not always, that he has little time left to be a great father." Nelson Mandela's daughter was quoted as saying this to her father: "You are the father of all our people, but you have never had time to be a father to me." Now, Nelson Mandela is known and respected by millions throughout the world, but his own daughter never felt like he was a father to him. Why? Because if we aren't careful as leaders, we're giving the best part of ourselves to everybody else, but leftovers to the people who should matter the most, and that is our spouse, and that is our kids. Our family is our first priority. Our family is our first ministry. Rabbi Kushner also told in this book, he related that one time he read a story inside of a magazine about a fictional story about a pastor of a mid-sized church. And one night he had a dream, and this voice in this dream said, "There are 50 teenagers in your church, and you have the ability to lead 49 of them to God, but lose out on only one. Well, he woke up energized that I could reach 49 teenagers inside of our church. And so he started throwing himself into the youth ministry, and he ended up building an incredible youth ministry. In fact, it drew national attention. Then one night, his 16-year-old son was arrested for selling drugs. His son had become bitter and turned his back on God because the pastor had put all his time into reaching the 49, and he didn't yet realize that the one he was losing was his own son. What does it profit a man to win the whole world and lose his family and lose his own home? So I want to encourage you, as you are pursuing leadership, as you're pursuing becoming a great success, don't sacrifice your marriage. Don't sacrifice your kids. And I believe that when we put God first and we follow his priorities and we give the best parts of ourselves to our family, then the appropriate parts of ourselves to our career and to ministry and to friends, there will be enough left over for each level, and anything that didn't get what it needed probably didn't matter anyway. All right, look forward to seeing you next week as we continue in the life of David and some very important lessons on Absalom. We're going to look at how to identify an Absalom in case you ever come across one, or so you can never become one. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.